Once again, welcome to another episode of Costa Rica Crypto, and today I have the honor and the pleasure of talking to somebody who I've spoken to previously, the Honorable Mr. Thomas Cox. I'm really pleased to have you on here again, Thomas.
I don't know about the honorable part, but yeah, you got me.
We'll start with the honorable, and then we're going to kind of move through there. But
See if I merit that by the end of the call. By the way, I do have a bit of a cold, so if I cough a bit or if I sound like Kermit the Frog or something or Barry White, then you'll know why.
I don't think there's going to be any judgment here. I guess, once again, I'm just happy to have you sit down with me, and I really appreciate it. Once again, we talked in the pre-talk that, you're willing to do kind of any interview. That's one of the things.
I'll tell you the reason I think that for me, interviews are so incredibly important is because of my focus on governance. And, coders have to go take time off and code because what they write has to run on CPUs and run in virtual machines. Governance has to run in people. Got to run in their hearts, got to run in their minds. So I'm actually doing my job when I'm talking to you and when I'm engaging in Telegram and talking in small groups. This, unlike the other layers, the governance layer is intrinsically the people layer. Not to say that the user interface isn't important or that the code's not important. Of course it is. But governance is just a little different. And it's more people-centric.
Absolutely it is. And of course, we've talked before in the past about some of your experience and a lot of the professional coaching you do. So it's kind of like right up the alley. So,
yeah, well, so folks who either didn't see or don't remember, so my background includes undergraduate degree in psychology, dropping out of the master's program in sociology, 2 credits and 1 paper shy of my master's because I'm an idiot. Thought I'd be a journalist. So I tried that out, wrote for InfoWorld magazine for a whopping 3 months, and just wasn't cut out, at least at that point in my life, to be a journalist. There's a certain knack to it, or speed, or focus, or something. Ended up falling into a relational database work. Got hired by Oracle Corporation just a couple years out of school, and they didn't hire for knowledge of Oracle because in 1989 nobody. It was too new. It was growing too fast. You couldn't find people out in the world that knew it. So they would just, if you have good general knowledge, seem pretty smart, you got a degree from a top 10, 20 school, liberal arts major, they didn't care. They'd bring you on. And so we had these, amazing, like half the graduating class of Stanford, I thought, was getting hired by these guys at one point. Because they were growing like weeds. And so I got sucked into the Oracle machine and was taught relational database in a big and mighty way. And then I got to be a developer and eventually a database architect. So I got to walk that path between what people say they want, what they really want today, what they're going to want tomorrow, because databases are hard to change. And so I don't just want to code what they said or what I think they really mean. I had to figure out where they're going with this and give them a flexible structure that would meet their needs. And then I would try to stick around and implement the design so I could see how that clever, super hipster, I'm so smart thing was really dumb and accelerate my learning curve. And I went around that loop a bunch of times. And I developed major systems for organizations like Sony Music, and was an employee at IBM for a while and PricewaterhouseCoopers. And so I got some big company experience, worked for some small boutiques that were very fast and nimble, doing startup-like stuff, all in database for 15 years. And while I was doing that, of course, I was interested in, how do I make this all better? I'm a kind of a lean process fan. I like the Toyota production system. And so after about 15 years of database stuff, I kept noticing that our teams would struggle in predictable ways. And they typically would struggle around people issues. And it was the same scene again and again, a bunch of engineers sitting around a table trying to engineer their way out of a people problem. And it's just nothing more pathetic. Because we're not equipped, we're not trained for this, man. We're not trained for it. And we're trying to come up with a software fix for the fact that Fred won't talk to Barney. It's no, that requires leadership or management or something we don't have. And it was very, very frustrating to see good projects struggle for people issues. And then, of course, we'd all blame the technology. Why? Because the technology doesn't yell back, or hold a grudge. So I thought, man, if I could figure out this teamwork thing, if I could help technology teams work better, my God, I would be a happier man. My projects would run better. I might even be in demand. So around 2002, I think it was, thereabouts, I really got bit by the bug and I started studying leadership, which is an endless topic. So I tried to focus on technology teams and how do you lead engineers, which is still pretty rich. And I was, by 2014, I'd come up with my Becoming a Best Boss system that synthesized a ton of stuff that I'd learned doing podcasts and interviews, much like this one actually, of people much, much smarter than me. And I was getting ready to productize it. And then in 2017, as I was rolling it out and getting some good wins, and I got this call from my former boss, David Moss, who I knew from the Oracle days. And he's like, I'm working on blockchain. I need you. And I'm like, block what? So I start reading. And block.one was ramping up, and they had some really insanely tight deadlines. They needed to do multiple iterations in less than a year. So I got thrown into documentation as a contractor and then got offered vice president of product and became employee number 2 of the U.S. Organization in September, just over a year and 20 days ago. So that was like full on. It's like, I remember cramming for classes in college, and it was like that. It was like finals week every day for 9 months. That's what it was like. It was very, very intense. And I'm trying to understand the space, and of course no one understands us because we're not quite like other things. So even what I was reading from other chains wasn't entirely appropriate because of our differences. It's delegated proof of stake. There are these elections, but it's not like other forms of proof of stake. And oh man, very, very intense. And the fact that I had, in 2002, I had done one other thing that I didn't mention. I also mentioned lean, and game theory is another fascination of mine. Well, in 2002, I ran for governor of the state of Oregon. Got recruited to run as a libertarian, and lost obviously. But everyone told me I'd get 0.5% of the vote, because 0.5 is about what you get as a libertarian candidate for governor in a state like Oregon. But I campaigned full time, which most people don't do, and I apparently slightly more presentable than a lot of libertarian candidates for a lot of offices. So I got 5% of the vote, and that's interesting because the winner beat the loser by 1%. And here I'm, here's my voters, my 5%. Could have swung it either way, guys. Either one of you could have had these if only you'd appealed to them, but you didn't. I had to. And we became very politically relevant. People took our meetings at the state capitol. I think they basically said, if you have one bill that's really important to you and no one's profoundly opposed to it, we'll give you your bill, which they'd never offered before. That's a big deal. Fastest growing libertarian party in the country in the state of Oregon in 2003, the following year. So that felt good. And it also showed me the limits of, politics and the limits of third parties, and how hard it is to talk to people about fundamental ideas about life and liberty and property and limited government and autonomy and decentralization and concentrations of power and all that wonderful philosophical stuff that helps underpin the blockchain space. And I think it was that experience, that interest of mine in public policy, and the fact that I'd put skin in the game and run, helped mark me as somebody that Dan Larimer was willing to hire. And boy, is he. If you ever work with geniuses, they are unlike other coworkers. I'll put it that way. I learned a ton from Dan Larimer. Absolute ton. It's fun to watch him because you talk to him about a problem, and I swear I could see him thinking in source code, and then he would try to figure out, how do I translate that into English? And he'd like walk over to a whiteboard and try to think out loud, and then I'd go and turn it into a diagram and feed it back to him and go, yeah, I think you're getting it. So that was our back and forth. It probably would have helped if I were really good at C++, but I'm not. So I ended up very quickly taking on the role of lead for governance, because governance was a huge part of the work. Dan was really focused on the code, and governance includes a lot of stuff that's not code, like Ricardian contracts, like the Constitution, like the back and forth with the community, so that, if the Constitution says something but no one understands that it says that because they don't understand it the way you wrote it, you're screwed. That's why the founding fathers of the United States wrote the Federalist Papers. Of course, they had years to work on it, and they had a much larger team than we had. And many of them had written constitutions for their states, so they all knew the domain pretty well. And there was still a lot of debate and discussion and disagreement on what certain words would mean in practice. And that was an incredibly important thing for them to do, and a similar process had to happen, we thought, for us. So I led a bunch of community conversations, and I visited meetups, and spoke to small groups around the United States in person and around the world by video, to walk people through the thinking that, well, it's going to be kind of like a government, in that there's this legislative function that the token holders take on, because they vote. They vote for block producer, and they can vote in referendums. They can set policy. And then these block producers, they're kind of analogous to the executive branch, because they carry out policy. And they get, voted in, they can get voted out. Their job is very clearly defined. And then there needs to be an interpretation process, dispute resolution, arbitration, and so forth, kind of like a judiciary. And so here's how that might work. And created diagrams and gave talks, and it fielded a bunch of very challenging questions, which really helped sharpen up our thinking and our speaking. And I thought we had a pretty good constitution by the time we were done. And of course, we launched, and everybody hates it, because everybody hates their constitution, or at least some part of it, or they hate how other people don't get it, or it needs to be this other way. During my work on the Constitution in particular, I found a website that has a database of every constitution of every country on the planet, and with different versions of the Constitution going back a couple of decades. And they are all over the map in terms of what things should or shouldn't be mentioned, what things should or shouldn't be protected, like the word arbitration or dispute resolution. Does that show up in some constitutions and not others? Property rights, are those even defined in constitutions? Some do, some don't. What things are considered inalienable rights? The Germans have this right to dignity of the individual. What the heck is dignity? Like, can you define that? Well, they think they can. They put people in jail over it, or fine them, or whatever. Take people to court over, you've denied a person their dignity. Well, I hope they can explain it to me, because I don't want to go to jail, but I don't understand the problem. Or at least I don't understand what the right's supposed to be saying. So we're in a space right now, today, post-launch, with still no referendum code written. We had to launch without that. We launched without several governance pieces. That was one. And so the initial thinking was we would either ratify or replace the initial constitution within a couple of days to a week or a month, but there was no code to do that. So the Constitution's in this interim pre-ratified state. I mean, it's still binding. You joined the chain, right? It's there to be looked at. You're signing transactions that reference block headers that contain in the ABI the text of the Constitution. Okay, there's like a clear chain that you touch this chain, you had access to that Constitution. And everything in the white paper says, look, you're agreeing to the Constitution when you use the chain. So, to the extent we have any sort of governance, it's pretty clear what's governing. And, Dan Larimer at one point explicitly had to say in Telegram, yes, the current Constitution is binding. Yes, the current arbitrators are in charge of arbitration. Yes, this is how it's working. And a lot of the fans of Dan, who will do whatever he says, go, oh, okay. Like, whatever. So we have a half-governed chain right now, because we don't have these core pieces like the referendum code. And in particular, I'm particularly upset at myself for thinking that the arbitration setup that we had in place in time for launch, the ECAF, was adequate. And the reason I thought it was adequate was because we were getting pretty detailed guidance from some folks who had done a similar project called CA Cert. And CA Cert was an old, this is back when SSL certificates had to be hand signed, to prove that Coca-Cola.com was owned by Coke and not by somebody else. Who owns these domains and who certifies that that's true? And what's your web of trust for that? And naturally, these things would fall into dispute. Like, well, I bought it from him. Well, I bought the same thing from this other guy. So who owns it? And the contracts that people were signing when they got involved in the system called for binding arbitration. CA Cert had set up volunteer arbitrators. Very much, here it is, online, international, like all very similar domain, right? Looking very, very plausibly similar in setup. And we had two people who had set up the arbitration system, Eva Stowe and Ian Grigg. And Ian Grigg had also set up, he'd worked on like digital cash and e-gold and Ethereum. Now, he's been involved in crypto and electronic money for decades, and he's the inventor or co-inventor of the Ricardian contract. So we figure they must know what they're doing, and they fully expected that we would have a very slow ramp up of cases. That might be weeks or months for the first case, that we could onboard some people and build out the infrastructure and figure out what our case workflow would be and all that. Plenty of time to do all that. Now, hundreds of cases in the first week just slammed us. We're like, what do we do? So I was scrambling, tasking people onto that from other things they were supposed to do to build out process steps and put together a ticketing system to track things, and supporting Moti, who I had recruited, and asked him if he'd use his entrepreneurial skills and help spin up this new arbitration for him. And he's an entrepreneur, likes a challenge. He's like, sure, I'll try that. Why not? And got himself all educated on arbitration. And we all shared this assumption that it would be a slow start. And here we are, slammed. And no resources. I had not asked for, 10 FTE and thousands of dollars for block.one. And I've got one foot out the door, right? Chain's already launched. I told them back in February that post-launch I would be leaving, which was totally an agreed thing. Dan Larimer and I talked about that several times, that once we launch, the relationship between block.one and governance and the mainnet would change utterly. block.one would no longer be able to write anything it wanted to and stick it in GitHub, and that was the reference information. Now it would be the community deciding what the governance documents would say. And block.one would just maybe have a vote. And when you change that radically, somebody like me has either got to stick with governance, which means I got to leave block.one, or I stick with block.one, in which case I got to take my hands off of governance and do other things. And I thought, I got to stick with governance. That's really what interests me. It fascinates me. So here it is, middle of June, late June. I'm a short timer. No one's going to give me money and staff to work on ECAF. block.one can't afford to work on ECAF. We've already launched. They're just a community member. They have no authority to do any of that. And of course, their lawyers are constantly telling them, don't look like you own the chain. Don't behave like you own the chain. If you behave like you own the chain, you can be sued. Okay. And so they're, every day we were living under this sort of Damocles of like, don't act like you own the chain, right? The community owns the mainnet. And so again and again, people, normal people are just like, why isn't block.one stepping up and fixing this? They can't. They can't just write some code and say, here, go do this. Because the worst thing would happen is we'd all salute and go do it. And now, well, that makes them look like they're in charge, doesn't it, in a court of law? And they could propose it for a referendum, but there's no referendum code. So
Where is the solution to all this, Thomas? What do we need to do?
Well, we need to bootstrap the rest of the way into full function. It's like we were born without fully functioning lungs, and this main net has been like an infant in the ICU with oxygen and help with its kidneys, and we need to develop all of the functions of the body, right? And that means a referendum, the ability to do referenda, the ability to at least vote on whether or not to use the WPS fund. And if we do use it, to use it in a very responsible, transparent, and accountable way.
How do you feel about the WPS fund? Where's your stance on that?
I'm a big believer in the incredible power of established norms as the thing that helps people through difficult times. If we'd already held 3 or 4 referenda and somebody wanted to do a new one, we would all assume that the new one should be done like the last ones, because that's what we did already, right? But there is nothing to fall back on. In fact, this is another thing I feel very badly about, is we didn't even have a test net where we could try out things like WPS and walk people through it and get their feet wet and start to establish some neural pathways for folks. Code wasn't ready. We literally had to say in triage in like April and May, which things, if we don't finish them, the chain just fails, and which things, if we don't finish them, we at least hypothetically could finish them later, and the chain would function in the meantime. And so you can run a chain without referendum. Everybody else does. You can run a chain without a WPS functioning. A lot of them do. So those were on the list of things that were postponed.
What's the call of the community? How can people help you solve this?
There's a number of groups working on referendum code, on WPS logic, and so forth. My personal thinking is, if we just throw away WPS, we're throwing away an opportunity for the chain to pay for its own growth, which is, I think, a mistake. But I also don't think we have the institutions and the common mutual trust in institutions to take the entire balance out of WPS and stick it somewhere and start spending it. That just feels too risky to me, because we've seen a lot of scammers. We've seen people playing games with voting. There's some proof, arguably, of collusive voting, at least among some block producers and their underlying anonymous benefactors. It looks at least suspicious to some folks. And in a case like that, and you get people who are block producers who don't actually do any of the things or half the things in the reg producer contract, which they signed when they agreed to be block producers. So they said they'd do it, they're not doing it, but they're getting paid as if they were doing it. And nothing happens. And the reason nothing happens is no one has taken them in front of ECAF and taken them to into arbitration. I think a case might have been filed, but it hasn't gone anywhere that I'm aware of. And so if you don't enforce your rule, it makes people very nervous, correctly so. So if it were me and I was asked, hey, what would build confidence and build institutional infrastructure and build strength in the community to use WPS wisely, it would be something like what we're seeing the WPS group do, which is take a small amount, pull it out of WPS and stick it in a spending account with very specific explanations of how it's going to be used and who's going to oversee its use, because you got to oversee spending. And then everything else, burn it. Don't turn off the faucet, but there's an accumulation in there of a lot of tokens. I would burn them all and then let new accumulation start, so that by the time the small amount that's been pulled out and spent has been spent, we will have seen, is this a trustworthy process? Is it working? Are we getting value for that money? I think we have to experiment. We have to be willing to lose a few bucks in the process of experimenting. Now, we don't have enough in WPS to replicate some of the learning experiences of Ethereum. We don't have a parity wallet available to us to blow like 300 million bucks. We haven't got a DAO hack waiting to happen yet that I'm aware of. times, hey, it's a young chain. We'd still get around to that. But even so, even a small loss of WPS funds would shake confidence. So I think it needs to be done very carefully and very transparently. And we need to get good value for money, and we need to be seen doing it. That were to happen, people might say, well, okay, we'll try that one more time. And then maybe a little bit more. And then, of course, we'd have to build out the mechanisms for spending wisely with oversight. There's a cryptocurrency called Dash, some of you are familiar with. And Dash has been running a WPS-style spending account for years. And they have proposals, and they vote on them, and they oversee them. And one of the proposals was to hire project managers and program managers to oversee the other projects, which I think is brilliant. Right, but they grew to that level of sophistication over years. We haven't done that yet. So we can look at their prior art, we can be informed by it, and we can admire it, and we have to do our own thing, maybe similar to that.
So ultimately, what's the, like in a very simplified version, what's the best use of these funds, Thomas? Like, of course, you're not the one who's going to make, the end all be all decision.
Well, ultimately, it's up to the token holders, and they will have their own perspective on it. I think it would be probably smart to put a chunk of money one time into ECAF to get them to have a reserve fund they can use to pay the arbitrator, so they're not volunteers working in their spare time, but full-time people who are working to resolve the backlog of cases, and they can, pay for their own infrastructure. Right now, ECAF is still running on a ticketing system that's paid for on my personal credit card. I'm donating that. Now, I'm also expensing it through my employer, so I'm not all that generous. But there was no guarantee that they were going to approve that expense, and so I was maybe going to have to eat that. It's a couple $100 a month. And that's, I don't talk to my wife about that money because I'm not sure how she'd feel about it. But I feel some responsibility, so I'm willing to, stick my neck out and put my credit card out there and have them charge me a couple $100 every month. It helps to ease the process that they've got a system to track cases. They need that, and I'd like them to be able to pay for it themselves and not be dependent on charity.
What's your appeal to the community in regards to ECAF arbitration?
There's a few people who are very loudly skeptical, and often it's nitpicking around things that should have been different the first couple of days, as if we could go back in time and change that. And often those same loud voices have nothing constructive to say about how to do it differently. And when some folks I respect went around in person and visited a bunch of Chinese large holders, what they reported on those trips was that there is an assumption that of course we should have arbitration, and that even ask the question is silly. So it's possible that funding for ECAF would just sail through with a very easy, large, positive vote. Who knows? But there's really literally no way to sense the mood of voters. Like, we can't go to any of the polling outfits and have them phone up a bunch of voters and find out, voters are in favor of, motion X by 3-2 margin or something. No one knows. It's only by voting that we will discover this. So what would I spend money on? ECAF, probably a little bootstrap money for them to get them off the ground. Then they need to pay their own way with case fees. I think we should probably put a chunk of money to reimburse Nathan James for Scatter, which he has written on his own time. Why can't we just give him a stipend and have him work on EOS full time and just quit it with this day job nonsense?
It's funny because I always say that if I wanted to see anybody amass a particularly large amount of wealth, because I've talked to NSJames before, it would be that man, because some people would take the money and go spend it on Lambos. That guy would just build some of the craziest stuff we've ever seen if he had the opportunity to. It was really altruistic. I'm a huge fan. And Scatter, it was a gift to the community.
Yeah, and he's still working on it. He's developing it. He's adding to it. He's got the desktop version, the Chrome version, and the Android version just came out. And it's wonderful stuff. It looks really solid. People are building on it. It's a great, great gift to the community.
Absolutely. And yeah, maybe, ultimately the worker proposal fund could help to make some more of those things a reality. I guess.
Yes, maybe. See, here's the thing: is if that money had been placed into the hands of some body or bodies who are responsible for it, then we could turn to them and say, "Okay, go do that." But instead, it's just like out there, and it's quote the communities unquote. But there's no structure around it. There's no process. There's no method. There's no people. There's no representative, whatever. And so it's. Yeah, everyone's looking at that and going, God, I hope it doesn't get stolen. That's like everyone's first thought. We really don't want that stolen. We're gonna look like clowns if that gets stolen. Not to mention the fact that the money could be used either deflation, burn it for deflation to increase the value of remaining tokens, and or spend some of them on really useful things like a professional security code audit. Maybe, I don't know if those are useful or not, but I've heard some people say it'd be a really good idea. I think paying NSJames to be a full-time, freelance guy who works on EOS wallets would be fabulous. I think there's probably 3 or 4 other things that you can see in the WPS channel being discussed that have a pretty plausible claim for, would benefit the community. Nobody will pay for it out of their own pocket, which makes the WPS the perfect place to fund them. If we're going to do them at all, we probably should. Probably a voting portal, probably a WPS management system at some point might make sense.
I think we're probably we're gonna cut it off there. I'm gonna ask you, where can people come to find you, to talk to you, to get in touch, and spend some time talking about some of these proposals, spend some time getting involved in the community and getting involved in the worker proposal system?
Yeah, so the WPS, there's a channel for that. There's a public chat for WPS. There's the Gov channel, which I'm in quite a bit. And because of my work with the Alliance, there's the Alliance public open discussion group. And if you, put @ Thomas B. Cox, I will see it on my Telegram and go, oh, someone's referencing me, and I'll go check. I'm pretty good about that.
100%. I think it would be good for me to be able to maybe get yourself and NSJames and some other people kind of in a room. I'm talking with Saeed as well from EOS Cafe about doing like an EOS late night show where we just kind of everybody comes on and we have different topics. So I think it'd be cool if you could join me for that sometime.
Happy to do it. If my schedule allows, I absolutely will.
So I just want to thank you, Thomas, for spending a little bit of time with me, talking about some of the things that are important to you. I'm going to make sure that I post all the links for the EOS Alliance and some of the other things that we chatted about below. And I look forward to maybe doing a little bit of the EOS late night show with you and talking to you again about some of this stuff soon.
I look forward to it.
Thanks, Thomas.